So good evening and welcome back for the last of these sessions. It's been a pleasure exploring with you, and I know that we've had some people who have been part of, I don't know how to deal with this, by the way, because I know, but there's only one speaker, it's just you're hearing my voice and you're hearing me coming out of there. But if we don't have me coming out of there, then what if I did this? What if I did this? Yeah. Hold on. Right, but I don't know if they can hear me. Can you hear me on Zoom right now? Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. That was what we needed to do. So I know that we've had some people who've been at all three sessions, some who have been at two, and I see a couple of people who haven't been at any of them up until now. So welcome in all cases. It's going to be a little bit of a whirlwind. We're going to be touching on a number of different areas that are really sort of picking up from some of the different places and some of the different areas that we've been exploring. So I'm aware at the beginning of the second session, I did a little bit of a recap of the first session. I don't want to do that again today because I think I'd be repeating myself too much, but I will say, and this is especially directed toward anybody who's new, who hadn't been at any of the other two sessions, if something that I'm saying seems utterly confusing or incomprehensible, rather than me, again, going and sort of doing a more formal recap at the beginning, I'll instead sort of dive in and we'll take questions, whatever, as they come up. But I will say that it is some of these things are going to make more sense to people who are at the previous sessions. That being said, thank you for not being dissuaded. If you weren't, it's good to have you here. So I wanted to start by sort of wrapping up one piece that we talked about a fair amount last time, but wanted to bring in a couple of other examples and bring in another aspect of. So in our topic, obviously, is the Hebrew Aleph Bet. And that's what we're going to be, continuing to focus on, although you'll see how that's going to take us into the realm of names as we get a little bit further into our program this evening. But one of the aspects of the Hebrew Aleph Bet that we talked about last week toward the end, and which is familiar to a lot of us, is the idea of gematria, right? The idea that each of the Hebrew letters is assigned a numerical value. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, and it keeps going up. Once you hit Yud, which is 10, Kaf is 20, Lamed is 30, Mem is 40, right? When you get to Kuf, which is 100, then Resh is 200, Shin is 300, Taf is 400. There are actually several different systems by which gematria can be calculated. That's the most common and the most standard. There are some other ones for doing that. Gematria is not, we noted, something that was unique to Hebrew, that ancient Babylonians and some of the other people living in that area and in that time period also had something similar, where there were numerical correspondence to letters. And in fact, although it's not the same thing, we're aware of Roman numerals, right, where letters are used to substitute for values, although it's not the same thing. But still, it's not a completely unfamiliar idea. And the point of gematria is, again, sort of for us, it might seem essentially like parlor tricks. And, I shared a couple of examples of gematrias that were brought, last week. So just an example of one that, to my mind, by the way, feels very much like a parlor trick, is the idea that if you take the word for father in Hebrew, Av, it's got a gematria value of 3. If you take the value of mother, Am, 41, right? Add those together, you get 44. What's the value of the Hebrew word Yeled, which means child? It's 44. You bring a father and a mother together, you get a child. Well, first of all, if only it were that easy. Second of all, there might be 2 fathers or 2 mothers who might be having a child together, but it's cute, but it doesn't really teach us anything. It's just kind of, as I said, a little bit of a parlor trick. But for the ancient rabbis, right, because of the nature of the letters, because the letters were not arbitrary, because the letters were sort of these vessels for holding different aspects of God's energy, right? That sort of came through and were sort of made manifest in different ways depending on which letter, right? And so each letter has different kinds of properties. Therefore, the connections that were made by virtue of, not made, but were revealed by dint of gematria, were in fact trying to tell us something that was real and objective about the connection between different things. So just like, and I know I keep coming back to this example, but just like, for example, if we think of our letters as elements, the building blocks of reality, and if we think about the fact that elements tend to get assembled in a periodic table, right? And the periodic table is constructed the way it is because certain elements in the same rows are going to have same columns, are going to have certain common features. So, right, if you understand something about if you look all the way to the right-hand side, you have the noble gases, you have these in it, right? You know something that connects the elements that are in the same column because they have similar physical properties, right? So that was the same idea that the rabbis were thinking about when they were thinking about letters have objective existence. Each of the letters have certain qualities. Among those qualities are that they are associated with certain numerical values. And so if you were able to take two words that have the same numerical values, right, the letters in them add up to the same total number, then those two words that form from them are going to have some kind of commonality, just like if you took two molecules and that were assembled from certain sort of sets of atoms with similar properties, you're going to get two molecules that have some kind of relationship with each other. It's not a perfect analogy, obviously, but again, it's just a way to get us thinking about the fact that something that might seem crazy to us, right, which frankly it does. We believe in a lot of crazy things, right? And we believe that the world is made up of 98 different elements that we can't see, but somehow there are these 98 tiny building blocks that are beyond our imagination, combine and recombine in endless forms, and a variety to be able to make everything that we have in front of us. That's also a pretty crazy story to tell. So anyway, so we talked about some examples of gematria. One of the ones in particular that I like, just because it if nothing else, it's that Av and Am, the father and mother, you add them up to to get Yeled, you add them up to get child. That's answering a question nobody's really asking. But what happens if you use gematria to answer a question that maybe people have, or give us some kind of insight about some aspect of Torah where we didn't have it before? And again, I know I'm aware I'm repeating this one, and then I'm going to bring in a couple of new examples in a moment. But a couple of weeks ago in the Torah, we have the situation, Parshat Lech Lecha, where Abraham's nephew Lot is kidnapped by the king of Sodom, by the king of Sodom. And Abraham goes after Lot to try to pursue him, try to save him. And he takes with him, the Torah is at pains to tell us, 318 men. 318 men Abraham takes. A very sort of bizarre and specific detail that the Torah provides without any explanation. Why 318? Who are these 318 men? Where does 318 come from? The Torah doesn't give any answers, right? But it is a little bit of a question, right? If you're reading the Torah and you read the sentence, that's strange, right? Why not 300? Why not about 300? What's 318? And so the rabbis and the Talmud look at 318 and they remember that Abraham has a trusted servant whose name is Eliezer. They take the value of the letters Aleph, Lamed, Yud, Ayin, Zayin, Resh, add them up together, boom, 318, right? And so from that, the rabbis come to the conclusion that the 318 men that Abraham takes with him are some coded reference to Eliezer, to his trusted servant, either to say that Eliezer himself was somehow sort of equivalent to, and as powerful as 318 men, or maybe even somehow the 318 men that the Torah says that Abraham sends are in fact just a reference to Eliezer. It's sort of a cryptic reference to say Abraham sent his servant Eliezer. Again, absolutely not the pshat, absolutely not the plain meaning of the text, but it is interesting to see the way gematria is used to take something that seems confusing in the Torah, 318 men, why? What's going on here? Torah seems to be calling our attention to a very particular, very specific number and trying to offer some kind of explanation, which, by the way, also lends itself to further interpretation to give us a sense of just how respected Eliezer was in Abraham's household, how powerful he was, and so forth, right? Right. So that's an example of using gematria that I had brought last time as a way to be able to help clarify something or to be able to offer some kind of teaching. I had a couple more that I wanted to just mention quickly because they were kind of interesting ones. I was actually learning some Talmud a couple of days ago, and I just came across this reference, which I had not seen before. I thought it was kind of interesting. If you take the word Hasatan, Satan, what's Satan? Satan is Satan. And it's worth pointing out, by the way, that the term Satan does show up in Tanakh, does show up in the Bible, although it doesn't have generally the same sense. Most notably in the book of Job, it doesn't seem to have quite the same sense that it takes on later in Christian and in popular imagination of some completely evil adversaries, so much as maybe the almost like the prosecuting attorney, right? If we do something wrong and we're going to be called for judgment, well, God is thought to be merciful. God wants to forgive. God wants to be lenient. Somebody has to stand up for the side of justice. That doesn't mean that that person is opposed to person. I'm using the word person obviously broadly, is opposed to God. That doesn't mean this person is somehow outside. This person is part of the system. Their job is to make sure that the demands of justice are articulated and paid attention to. So, right, Hasatan is this, sort of the advocate within the system that helps uphold the demands of justice by making sure that people are arguing to God, that people should be held firmly to account for the wrongs that we have done, which again later evolves into this idea of a devilish state. Anyway, if you take the word Hasatan, the accuser might be a good way to translate that. The gematria of Hasatan, I didn't give the sheets back out, and I wouldn't make you do the math anyway. It's too late for math. Is 364. So what do they do with the fact that Hasatan adds up to 364? Well, they point out that a year has 365 days. And so somehow there's some relationship between Hasatan, 364, 365-day year. Roger, I see your hand and I know what you're going to say. Let me finish. What's that? I didn't know what you were going to say. What you're going to say is exactly right, actually. I thought you were going to say 365 days. Wait a second. That's not what a Jewish year is. Because a Jewish year is not typically 365 days, right? 365 days is a solar year. The Jews usually operate by a lunar calendar, which will give you usually on the order of somewhere between 354 and 384 days, depending on how you count it. And so where did this 365 come from? The answer is it came, the rabbis lived in Roman times and they lived under a Roman system, and the Romans, created this solar year of 365 days. So the rabbis were very much aware of it and also took it as another sort of way of counting and measuring time, even if it wasn't sort of the primary way that we were supposed to do it. Certainly not the way that you would use to sort of calculate when holidays fell. But you're exactly right, Roger, right? So they say 364 connected to Satan, 365, right? So there seems to be one of those days that somehow Satan does not have any kind of control over, any kind of sway over. And that day is Yom Kippur, right? So if we take it especially as thinking about Hasatan as our Yetzer Hara, right? Our evil inclination, or maybe even this idea of the accuser, whoever's trying to like hold us to account, stern judgment, right? We should be held fully accountable for our sins. No, not this day. This day, either, they are as an act of loving mercy, our Yetzer Hara, our evil inclination, is held in check, or alternately, it's a day when God doesn't listen to the accusations, right, of this figure. Instead, right, Yom Kippur is this day that is outside, right, the 365th day that's outside of the 364 days that Hasatan generally controls. Okay, so that's one example. Another example, it's actually the last one that I wanted to bring, but interestingly, from this week's Parsha. Jacob, right, he first bought his brother Esau's birthright for a bowl of lentil soup, and then subsequently, part of his mother's instigation, dresses up as Esau, goes into Isaac's room and steals Esau's blessing. Esau is understandably upset. Esau, perhaps less understandably, threatens to kill Jacob. Jacob runs away from home. He arrives at a place. He falls asleep and he has a vision. And in that vision, he sees a ladder that's planted in the earth, right, with its top reaching into the heavens. The word for ladder that gets used in the Torah is sulam, right? Sulam has a gematria of 130. And there's another sort of tallish, vertically oriented object that is planted in the earth, reaching toward the heavens, that maybe has angels going up and down on it as Jacob's ladder does, that has a gematria of 130, and that's Sinai. Right, the word Sinai also has a gematria of 130. And so there's a connection that's made between those things. The ladder of Jacob's dream and Mount Sinai, and the suggestion that what Jacob actually sees in his dream is some kind of vision of the upcoming revelation. After all, what does Jacob say when he wakes up? He wakes up and says, Achen yesh Adonai b'makom hazeh v'anochi lo yadati. Surely God is in this place and I did not know, right? So there seems to be this place where there is a more ready connection between God and human beings. Who's Jacob? Jacob, of course, is going to be renamed Yisrael, Israel. He's the ancestor of Israel. It's his seed that's going to go down to Egypt. It's his seed that's going to be brought out from Egypt and given the gift of Torah. So even as he's running away in his darkest moment of despair, alone, running away from home, outside, cold, using a stone as a pillow, right? He's given this vision that promises, look what's happening. Look what your ancestors, not your ancestors, look what your descendants are going to receive. Look at this gift. The sulam is a hint, is a little bit of a symbol of Sinai. So let me just pause there quickly. I don't know that there are going to be any responses, but I just wanted to make sure because I've been talking a lot. Okay. So anyway, and we talked more about gematria last time. I don't want to belabor it this time. I will say, by the way, that it's interesting to recognize that in addition to gematria, there are also other ways the letters are used, including even in the Tanakh itself, to be able to try to encode things. So there's a sort of a system that the rabbis use sometimes is a little bit of, it's one part of a code, but it's one part maybe another technique that the rabbis imagine will help us get some kind of insight into the letters. But the rabbis did not make it up. It is actually shows up already in Tanakh, and that is called atbash. Has anybody here heard of atbash? Is that a familiar term? So I'll tell you what atbash is. I'm seeing head shaking. I'm gonna write, hold on. Okay. I've written the Hebrew alphabet, and what I did was, this is the first half, this is the second half, right? What is Atbash? Aleph, Taf, Bet, Shin. Okay, Atbash is an acronym for Aleph, Taf, Bet, Shin, and what it is a method of encoding the Hebrew letters. So instead of writing the actual letter, you write its mirror letter in another part of the alphabet. So if I wanted to write an Aleph, I'd write a Taf. If I wanted to write a Zayin, I would write an Ayin. If I meant Kuf, I would write I can't see what it's underneath, a Hey. And so it's a little bit of a cipher. And again, for the rabbis, this was yet maybe another technique that they could use in order to be able to sort of discern connections between the letters. But it actually shows up literally in Tanakh. Jeremiah, in a number of different places, makes a sort of strange and cryptic reference to an evil nation called Shashak. Okay, there's an evil nation, Shashak. There's only one problem. There's no nation called Shashak. We have no idea what Shashak is. That was probably the point. Why? Because if you are to take the letters of Shashak and put them into Atbash, which is clearly what Jeremiah was doing, that Shin Chet becomes Bet Lamed. Bet Lamed Bavel, Babylonia. Jeremiah was living under the time of the Babylonians. The Babylonians were in charge. You start writing nasty things about the Babylonians, they're probably not going to be very happy with you and come after you. If you encode it and say, Babylonia, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the wicked nation of Shashak. They're like, oh, okay, fine, go. We're not Shashak, but in fact they were. And there are other examples, by the way, in Torah and not Torah, in Tanakh as well, of this technique of Atbash being used in order to be able to, serve as a little bit of a code in order to be able to try to not say something clearly, right, that you want to say, just sort of try to hide information. But the rabbis will also occasionally use that as a device for trying to figure out what connections there are between, just like gematria might give some kind of ways to come up with interpretations, Atbash can be used sometimes that way as well. Okay. Another aspect of the letters that I wanted to bring up, which we talked about, which we alluded to briefly in passing. So we were looking at a number of letters, and we were looking at them, and there's repeating the form that the letters take. When the rabbis talk about the letters are the way they appear in the Torah, right? That's what the sort of your Platonic form of a letter is. It's not the way it might appear in different typefaces. It might look entirely different. Like the form of the letter they're talking about is the letter as it appears in the Torah. What letter do we have here? We have a nun, right? This is how it appears in the Torah, but not quite. This is not how letter nun appears in the Torah, because the letter nun is one of 8 letters that actually is it 8? Hold on. Sorry, it's 7 letters that appear with special crowns on them when they're written in the Torah. So if you were looking in the Torah and you saw letter nun, it would look like this. Okay, those 3 lines, which together constitute crowns. Tagin is the term that gets used usually for them. It's actually an Aramaic term. That's the way a nun is going to look in the Torah. And there is sort of a very specific number of letters. It's a shin, it's an ayin, it's a tet, it's a nun, it's a zayin, it's a gimel, and it's sadi. Those 7 letters get crowns when they appear in the Torah. And no one knows why. what is clear is that it's a very ancient practice. The Talmud already discusses, Rava, who's a 3rd century rabbi, discusses the fact and says, these are the 7 letters that get those crowns on them. And nobody really knows why. There's a story that the Talmud tells right in that place in Masechet Menachot, in the tractate of Menachot, about Moses going up to heaven at the time that he's going to receive the Torah, and the Torah is not quite ready yet, right? You go to somebody's house and they're making you're going over for dinner, but it turns out that your host hasn't quite yet finished putting the final touches on, you just got to finish garnishing whatever, the turkey, whatever else had to be done, carving the turkey. So God hadn't quite finished the Torah yet. What was God doing? According to this passage in the Talmud, God was busy affixing the crowns to the letters, to the shins and the ayins and the tats and the nuns, which, by the way, again, holds up this idea that we've returned to a time and again throughout this class, right? That the letters are not just human conventions, that they're not humanly created symbols that were made to represent different sounds as ways of being able, to convey words, and speech, but actually are these divinely created entities that have some kind of independent and objective existence. But it's not just that, right? God was actually forming, fastening these crowns. Like there's such a thing as a nun, but there's such a thing as a crown that had to be fastened to it. There's debate, by the way, in the later sources. Is the nun an ornamentation and an addition to is the crown an ornamentation to the nun or any of the other letters, or is it an integral part of the letters? It's unclear. What's clear is that Moses says to God, what's going on here? Why are you delaying giving us the Torah in order to attach these crowns? And God replies, in the future, there will be this rabbi named Rabbi Akiva. Many of us may have heard of him, 1st century Tana, and considered one of the greatest and most creative rabbinic minds of all time. And he is Akiva ben Yosef, is going to derive all kinds of layers of meaning from each and every one of these crowns. So I got to get the crowns on there. So he's going to be able to have something to be able to talk about. Because again, remember, from the rabbi's point of view, they weren't just interested in sort of the letters for the letters' sake. They were interested in what could the letters teach them. Well, if the crown is added to the letter, it must be to add some kind of new insight or meaning. We don't know what it is, by the way. We don't know what those meanings are. And there's debated. There's just this kind of cryptic statement that Rabbi Akiva was brilliant enough that he was able to interpret and to be able to derive meanings and derive laws from these different crowns that were on these letters. How is the crown made up? So I'm going to sort of break off into Kabbalah here for a moment. These are, after all, sort of a lot of these are kind of Kabbalistic tropes anyway here. So you have for these letters 3 different what are called zions, which are called basically strokes, but they look like little mini zions. And if you look closely, I'm going to hold it up more and Janet, I see your hand. I'll take it in your comment in just one second. If you look closely, and I'm holding it up more so the people on the Zoom can see, they're not all the same height. Right? They're not all the same height. That wasn't just because I was being sloppy and going fast. The tallest one is in the middle. The next tallest is on the right, and the shortest is on the left. And that's because, actually, there are different Kabbalistic sefirot that the lines sometimes get attached to, but most commonly, they get attached respectively to the idea of Tiferet, Chesed, and Gvora. Tiferet is sort of majesty that's made from the right and the left coming together. There's the right side of God, the right side of the sephirotic tree, which is associated more with mercy, the left side, which is associated more with justice, neither mercy nor justice on its own is actually a good thing. If you have pure justice or if you have pure mercy, the world cannot stand in either of those cases. In order for the world to be able to function, you need a blend of justice and mercy. So says the Kabbalists, and so says Judaism, actually, in a lot of different ways. And it makes a lot of sense if you stop and think about it. So actually, greater than either justice or mercy, greater either than chesed or gvura, is tiferet, is the blend between those two things that balances them and unifies them. So the tallest of the spines is the middle one, the one that's sort of this middle path. And then the other two are chesed and gvura, mercy and justice, in theory, evenly balanced in tiferet. But do we really want the exact same amount of mercy and justice? Do we really want the exact same amount, or wouldn't we like maybe just a little bit more mercy, right? If we're custom mixing, if we're making our own house blend of tiferet, wouldn't you like just a little bit more mercy in there? So we have our right-hand side, which is the side that's associated with mercy, just a little bit taller than our gvura, which is associated with judgment, with justice. Janet, go ahead. What were you going to say? Can you unmute?
So the story was Moses went up and God wasn't quite finished with the Torah. God was putting these crowns on some of the letters, but then God didn't put the crowns on all the letters, but then determined that it was finished.
Right. Because not all the letters are supposed to have crowns. And
God decided what letters were supposed to have them. And it was later that someone interpreted why these certain letters.
Well, there are different explanations that are offered as to why these letters. I will be honest, this is clearly one of those situations where the questions are better than the answers. Sometimes, it's worth pointing out. I just talked about Hasatan, right? The accuser. Well, all the letters of Hasatan, all 4 of those letters are among the 7 letters that are in the. So maybe there's something about these letters that need to be kept in check. Like maybe they're less crowns than they are some kind of almost, I don't know, manacles or something that are supposed to keep, or other interpretations offer that something that they indicate that the energy of these letters, instead of being contained entirely within the letters, and again, for those who are new this week, we spent time in the first and second class talking about a few specific letters and the way that their shapes actually even reflect for the rabbis something integral to be able to get some kind of understanding about their nature. And maybe there's something about these letters that indicates that their energy isn't wholly contained within the letters, but is somehow outside and around them. And so those crowns are sort of gesturing towards something else. Again, it's a situation where the questions are better than the answers. What we can say for sure is that these crowns on the Torah scroll have been part of, Torahs that are, more than 1,800 years. They're written on these specific letters. And the story that's told, is to say that story that I brought in the Talmud is to say they're integral to the Torah. They're not somehow extraneous or superfluous. To the extent that the Torah gets delayed by God actually taking the time to attach these letters. Janet, I don't know if they've finished with what you had wanted to ask, or was there more?
Yeah, no, that was it. I just wondered, God didn't explain to Moses why this would not. It was the rabbis later on that put an interpretation on it.
Correct, right. So the whole story of Moses up in heaven and interacting with God is in the Talmud anyway. It's a rabbinic creation, but it's worth pointing out, and this is just a sort of aside. This could be its own whole other class, but right at some level, what's this story saying? It's God saying to Moses, "You're not smart enough to understand this, but don't worry, the rabbis will come along and they'll explain everything and they'll fix everything." Which is a really interesting story for the rabbis to be telling, right? And by the way, if you think that somehow, if you think I'm being far-fetched there, if you think I'm sort of reading in a little bit too much to the story, there's another story that shows up in a similar place of Moses saying, "Oh, if this Rabbi Akiva is so great, I want to understand what are his teachings." And so God snaps God's fingers, as it were, and Moses is beamed down into Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash. Moses is beamed down into Rabbi Akiva's classroom, and he's sitting in the last row. Who sits in the last row? Well, the slowest students. Moses is the slowest student, and Akiva is giving all of these teachings about the Torah, and Moses doesn't understand anything. And one of the other students, a brighter student than Moses, asked Rabbi Akiva, how do we know what you're saying is true? And Akiva says, it's in the Torah according to what was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. And once Moses hears that, his mind is set at rest. Because although he doesn't understand it, he knows that it all flows from this tradition that he received. But I want to point out, right, for the rabbis, who after all are the ones who get to tell these stories, the rabbis are the ultimate interpreters and arbiters of what Torah means. Moses was a messenger boy. Moses was, in his Amazon Prime van, goes up to heaven, brings down the Torah. But then it's up to the rabbis to try to understand and interpret it. So, there are these crowns, and it's only, a particularly brilliant rabbi, like Rabbi Akiva, who's going to be able to make sense of it. Laura, go ahead. Yes. So just for those on Zoom, what Laura said is it's a way of saying there's always more to discover, right? This is not some kind of closed process. It's ongoing. Something we talked actually a little bit about last fall in the class on Midrash, the idea of being able to go in and either, depending on your orientation toward Midrash, fabricate or discern, right? Additional meanings that aren't evident in their plain sense in the Torah, but that the rabbis are able to extract from the stories and from the words of Torah. Yeah, go ahead. Is there an upside down resh in what letter? Is there an upside down resh in the nun? Oh, because you're thinking back to the other letters and how they were broken up and made up of other pieces. I haven't heard anybody say that. I guess it's, well, if you turn it over, we're facing the wrong way in order to be able to get a resh. I haven't heard that. By the way, it's worth pointing out that in addition to these 7 letters that actually get crowns, there are some letters that end up getting not crowns, but little single sort of crown spikes that end up coming up. So again, I want to be clear. Nobody knows sort of where exactly these come from, but this is a very ancient tradition. And to the extent that we're talking about the letters and saying that the letters as they are in the Torah represent kind of their ideal form, then that's an integral part of those letters. Now, speaking about how the letters are in the Torah, I did mention last time, I said that I had spent time when I was in Jerusalem studying with a sofer, studying with a scribe, in order to be able to understand more about sofrut, about being a sofer, but also about the letters themselves. And I did want to pass around. I know this isn't going to be super helpful for people on Zoom, but I did want to pass around what is called in Hebrew a pulmus, which is a quill, which is what's used. I know I'm aware that. What's that? It's from a Turkey. Yeah, it's from a Turkey. I'm going to just go back over here to where I can be seen and heard a little bit better. It's from a Turkey, which sort of is the ideal feather in terms of having a strong enough structure that you can carve it, the shape that you need, and it's got a hollow shaft, which all feathers do, in order to be able to hold the ink. And I also wanted to pass around a piece of parchment. And one of the things that I wanted to mention about the parchment that we might not really be aware of, but is just how strong parchment is, right? Parchment, of course, what Torahs are written on, is incredibly tough. I mean, it's leather, it's cured leather, it's cured animal hide, and it's very, very hard to rip or hurt. So I'm going to pass this around as well. Don't do this with the Torah. but I want you to really take this and pull and twist, and you can even try to rip it. You don't have to be gentle with it. I mean, if you really were determined, you could probably rip it, but give it a good tug and give a sort of a, you will see that it's not something. Yeah, Laura, that's the spirit. It's not something which is just casually going to fall apart. I should just say in passing, doing Hebrew calligraphy. I taught myself Hebrew calligraphy initially when I was getting ready to get married in order to write my own ketubah. I learned out of a book that said, don't make your first project your ketubah. I ignored that part of the book. I see my mom is laughing because she may remember this. But the truth of the matter is, writing and doing Hebrew calligraphy, and actually I'm going to assume that what I'm about to say is equally true of any kind of calligraphy, but Hebrew calligraphy is the calligraphy that I know, is an incredibly centering process. One of my favorite things when I just want to get into a meditative state is to just write pages of reishs. You mentioned reish because there's something for me very pleasing about the reish because it's an even in both directions. So then there's that right angle, and it's very the letter reish. Right, the letter reish. I remember the book saying, and then my teacher affirming later on, that there are sort of 4 elements, not elements in the sense of, but 4 steps to any time you're writing a letter. There's the placement of the pen on the paper is one, because that has, like the attack in playing a musical note, right? That has to be solid. Then there's the actual drawing of the pen in order to make your line. There's the turning whenever that happens, because like the reish is drawn in one stroke, you go and then you turn. And then there's this sort of stopping and removing your pen. And each of those actions has its own integrity. And it's worth pointing out, and I actually alluded to this last week, and I just wanted to take another minute to say a little bit more about this as well, that in Jewish tradition, there is a real integrity that comes with something being written by hand. And not just an integrity, but actually in some ways, how authoritative something is in some ways inversely proportionate to how easy it is to reproduce. So what do I mean by that? Right? Something's authority is inversely proportional to how easy it is to reproduce. So our most sacred writing that we have in our tradition is the 10 Commandments, literally chiseled in stone with a rock. Not a very easy thing to like run off 1,000 copies of, right? The Torah has to be written by hand. And right, we talked about this a little bit last time, that if you have the words of the Torah and even the shapes of the letters the way that they're supposed to be, right, and it's printed out by a high quality printer it's not a Torah. Right? It may have the words of the Torah in it, but it's not a Torah. It doesn't have the status of a Torah. It doesn't have the Kiddushah. It doesn't have the holiness. And that's because there's something about this idea of the intentionality of a person deliberately stopping and writing each of the letters, which I told a story last time about having written a mezuzah over the course of several months when I was in Jerusalem back in 2011. The scroll is still on our door, bedroom door. And oh, by the way, here's some rolls of parchment. Yeah. Yeah.
Shows its value and its uniqueness.
So Mark says, right, that paper money, right, in order to show itself as original, has all kinds of additional markings to watermarks and things, right? And each one has its own serial number to make it unique. A way that I might think about it is a little bit of the difference between, a Mother's Day card, which you buy in the store, which is mass produced, and a Mother's Day card, which a child, draws in school, right? And the mass produced Mother's Day card may have better artwork in the sense of it's easier to tell that that's like a child giving his mother a hug or whatever it is. It might have clearer, crisper letters, but the preciousness of the handmade card is that the parent knows that the child, that everything that's there is there because the child specifically created it, as opposed to, you just dashing something off, right? So there is this, in Jewish tradition, there's this integrity, but also importance and authority to something that's handwritten. So it's worth pointing out, because I said we're sort of, authority is in inverse proportion to the ease of reproduction. Right. So if you have sort of as your gold standard, to use your analogy, on one side, our 10 commandments are, that are carved in stone, right? And then you go to a Torah or something which has to be handwritten, and has to be handwritten by a scribe with special, with a special quill and a special whatever, right? And then from there, if you go to sort of in ancient times, well, first of all, Mishnah, for example, was not written down at first, right? Because there was a concern that if you write it down, it's going to lose some of its authority. It wasn't supposed to be just there for somebody to pick up and read. You were supposed to learn Mishnah, sort of the oral law. It's called oral law because it was, right, meant to be taught orally. It wasn't meant to be written down until it was in the 3rd century. But the idea is, right, if it's written down, anybody can pick it up and start reading it and can come to conclusions, and maybe wrong conclusions about what it says. If it's oral, you learn it by being taught it in a teacher-student relationship. So there's this idea that when you learn it, you're doing it in the context of some kind of relationship, somebody who knows you, who can guide you in learning the ideas, correcting errors, whatever it might be. Ultimately, the Mishnah got written down, of course. And when it got written down, it wasn't written, doesn't need to be written with a quill. It doesn't need to be written by a trained scribe. It doesn't need to be written on parchment. If a letter gets messed up somewhere, it's still okay. It's still a Mishnah that's got a messed up letter, unlike we've said about the Torah, right? If even one letter is damaged somewhere in one part of the Torah, the entire Torah is not kosher, right? So the Mishnah written down has, is easier to make a Mishnah than it is to make a Torah, and the Mishnah has less authority. But what happened? The Mishnah ended up getting sort of copied and copied down expanded on into the Talmud. It's a real pain to write this down. And then boom, the printing press came along. And the very first thing that was printed by Jewish printers in the 15th century was the Talmud. Because that was really, really hard to be able to copy. It's incredibly laborious to be able to copy over the 2,200 pages of the Talmud. But with the printing press, you could churn it out much more easily. Of course, the printing press requires even less direct involvement and direct work. And so something that's printed becomes even less authoritative than something that is written by hand, which is less authoritative than something that's not just written by hand, but calligraphed by a trained scribe according to a very certain, specific procedure. And it's worth pointing out, by the way, that if we take this trend to its logical conclusion, or at least to its next step, what's happened to all these texts? They've been digitized. They've been put online, where it's the easiest thing in the world to be able to get your hands on something. You can log into Sfaria. And by the way, if you don't know Sfaria, it's a wonderful website, which I highly, highly recommend. And you can have access to, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages worth of written text in a moment at your fingertips in a form which is so ephemeral, right, that it doesn't actually even have any physical existence at all. And anybody can, can chime in and add their notes to Sfaria and to be able to, to make their own source sheet. And so what you've had is and I want to name this as a somewhat disturbing idea, right? You have this democratization of access, and as you have this democratization of access, you have a lessening of authority, right? Because authority was rooted in the idea that only a few select people, who were the people who, knew what they were doing and were supposed to have access, were able to get their hands. So that's a little bit of a conceptual digression, but I just wanted to hold up this idea to think about, because we're talking about letters and we're talking about writing, about how authoritative something is that's actually written by hand when we're in a world where things aren't written by hand. When's the last time they used, if you have something really important to say, if you have a thank you note that you really want to, you write it by hand, but that's not, we might be more likely to type it up and, and print it and stick it in the mail, or even more likely to just dash off an email or a text, or right, because it's easier and it's easier and it's easier, but as it gets easier and easier, there's less weight attached to it. So I don't know. I'm sorry for that digression. I find it fascinating, but it is complete and utter digression. So I wanted to jump to names. So let me just quickly say, because I'm switching gears here. Anybody, any comments or questions or anything that we've talked about so far? Okay. I wanted to talk about names because, and this shouldn't be surprising based on what we've said about letters and sort of Hebrew letters. A name is more than a word by which we identify something in Judaism, right? It's in Jewish thought, a name is not simply something by which we identify something. It's something that reveals the core essence of the thing that is being discussed, right? Because after all, right, the letters come from God, they're vessels of divine energy, and the way that the letters are combined into words or into names are not arbitrary, but actually do so in ways that are inherent to the quality of the item itself. Our names are not just arbitrary. They say something, they reveal something deep about who we are. And by the way, for everybody who was here last week, I asked everybody to write down their Hebrew names, and I've got a parting gift for everybody who did that. I'll say more about that a little bit later. But the name tells us something about sort of the essence of the thing being described. It's why, by the way, right, God's name is unknowable and unpronounceable. We can't know God's essence. We can't understand God's essence. So God's name is unpronounceable. It's unknowable. If we remember, and if we don't, we're going to be coming to it in next week's Parsha. So not this Saturday, but the following Saturday. Jacob is going to wrestle with an angel. And Jacob is going to ask the angel his name, and the angel is going to refuse to tell him. Why is the angel going to refuse to tell Jacob his name? Because if you have something's name, then you understand something about the essence of that thing, of that entity, and that gives you maybe even some kind of control or power over it. So the angel refuses to tell Jacob his name. Yitzhak Luria, who was sort of the founder of the Lurianic school of Kabbalah, writes, when a person is born and his father and mother give him his name, we're very, heteronormative here. When a person is born and his father and mother give him his name, the Holy One puts into their mouth the particular name required for that soul. Right? In other words, we might think that we as parents are picking names for our kids, but we're not. We're just kind of these vehicles, we're these mouthpieces for God, who actually knows what the name is that is connected to the deep soul essence of this brand new precious life. that we as parents have been entrusted with. And although we pick a name, it's actually God who's sort of operating behind the scenes to ratify that name. Because otherwise, like, how are we supposed to know if a name is connected to sort of the deep essence of somebody? Well, how are we supposed to know? You know, we're brand new parents. How are we supposed to know who our child is and who our child is going to become? Well, we don't, but God knows. So Luria says God is operating behind the scenes to put God's finger on the scale to make sure we give the right name, which is kind of a cute way of squaring the circle of saying, yes, the parents give the names, but nonetheless, the names are related to the deep essence of the person being named. And I will say, by the way, and I don't know what anybody else's experience is, and I know I'm going to get more nods from my mother on this one. First of all, with all three of our kids, we did not know the gender of the kids. We did not want to know before our kids were born if they were going to be boys or if they were going to be girls. And we certainly did not know their names because we didn't feel that we could name our kids until we met them. How can you name a person that you haven't met? And so it's interesting, for example, with Tzvi, that we did have certain names potentially that we were kicking around in mind. Like we knew that we wanted to give him a name that began with a T. And we had a couple of names in mind that we liked. And then he was born and we looked like, no, that's not the right name for this person. This is just not the right name. And it's stunning actually, because literally with a couple of hours old, we knew. And I don't know, if you've ended up giving somebody a name, if that's been your experience, to what extent it reflects your experiences. But with our kids, we needed to wait to meet them. And with Adir in particular, we needed to wait a good time. We didn't even know until basically the morning of his bris what his name was going to be, because he hadn't told us yet. So it is interesting to be able to sort of see how that comes up. The Talmud describes in its story about rabbis who are traveling. They're making their way and they come to a particular inn. And the innkeeper's name, he has an unusual name, Kidor. And Rabbi Meir, who's one of the rabbis is traveling with this group, says that name, there's something off about that name. And he connects it to a verse that talks about a verse of evil, wicked people, Kidor, for this generation that God will condemn. And Rabbi Meir says, I don't trust this guy. I'm not gonna leave my possessions where this innkeeper is able to get it at them. His traveling companions are saying that's ridiculous. Don't read so much significance into a name. They leave their possessions. It turns out the innkeeper is in fact wicked. And he makes off with their stuff, and only Rabbi Meir is able to keep his stuff because he paid attention to the fact that this name was revealing something about the character and the deep nature of this person. So it's a little bit of it's sort of a strange story, and the idea of something sort of so reductive. But I did want to it's another way that the Talmud is talking about the fact that the name of somebody, if we pay attention to it, can end up telling us something about their essence. I do want to pause here, by the way, long enough to ask if anybody does, either in person or on Zoom, have any sort of particular things that you want to say about your process, or what it was like when you were choosing names for your children, if there was something that you really learned from that process. Karen, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. So we actually named our son like even before he was thought of being conceived. And we knew that we were going to name him. Well, we knew if we were going to have a boy, what the name was going to be. And he's named after my grandfather and Mark's grandfather. And it's just completely ironic because you talk about, somebody having a name and being named after somebody and having their characteristics. You don't know him that well, but the people in the room or on Zoom that do, my grandfather was extremely, extremely outgoing. And my son is also very, very personable. And also Mark's grandfather, as well as my grandfather, they were both jokesters. they liked, they like to laugh. They like to have a really good time. And, to have a kid that, his passion is, to be the center of attention and actually have done stand-up comedy. It's just like, we knew the name, but like, it was just meant to be.
Lovely. And so I think that's exactly the type of situation where Yitzhak Luria, were he not dead for 600 years, would say, God had a hand in guiding that. Right? You hadn't met him yet, but you already knew what the name was that was going to end up sort of saying something about his nature. And in fact, right? Right. And in fact, you were right. So there's
and we didn't have a girl's name. And like, if we had a girl, we didn't know what it was going to be. And we played around with that. We also didn't know whether he was going to be a boy or a girl until he was born. But it was like, it had to be that name. It was, and then he just like grew into that personality.
Love it. Thank you. Susan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, if you're naming after a particular people and the Hebrew names say, how does that work? Is it that God has a hand in it anyway? That with your ancestors or your fathers or your grandfathers or whatever?
I mean, according to Yitzhak Luria, yes, right? The names are not random. Names don't just happen. A choice to name after a relative is a choice. A choice to name after a particular relative is a choice. So you could name after a relative, but you still might have several different forms of a name that you might give, right? So, even if you're planning on naming after a relative, which is a standard Ashkenazi custom to name after a relative who's no longer living, yes, and that does in some deep way connect them, by the way, to that person who's being named after, which is part of what Karen was getting at, and is presumably at some level part of what we're going for. If we're naming after a relative who's no longer living, presumably we're thinking of certain qualities that person embodied that we're hoping, right, are going to be, our child is going to take part in. So. Any other sort of naming stories? Because again, we don't usually get to name things, right? And then suddenly we get these lives, these precious new lives, and we sort of put our stamp on somebody who's going to be there for decades and very well, possibly, hopefully outlive us. So, right. So anything more about names, or should I move on? Karen, is that a hand?
Yes.
Good.
I was just wondering what happens when, you like one of my children was named after a grandfather, and she didn't know him and I didn't know him that well. So, I mean, it's difficult to try to figure that out. It's like when Karen said she knew that now her son actually has those characteristics, but when you don't know, now I have to start thinking about trying to find out about these people who my kids were named after.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I will say that one of the many wonderful parts of my job is I have the enormous privilege of being able to say, last week I sat down with these parents who were saying, what should our child's Hebrew name be? And they talked about what their hopes were for their child, and they talked about what the qualities and the attributes they were hoping for in the name. And I thought about it and I listened to what they were saying and I said a name and they're like, that's not quite right. And I said, and that's it. Right. And they just like immediately, right. It was like they recognized that name the moment. It was almost like that name was just waited, not for them to, just so much come up with it on their own and so much discover it. Like it was there waiting to be found. So, I mean, and I see this on a regular basis. It's actually a really lovely thing. Roger.
My father's generation.
People would change their names, yeah.
So my father, his father named him Isaac.
Yeah.
My grandmother like that, and so she changed his name to Herbert. Then Boris Stekov, his name was Max. And I had another cousin who changed.
Yeah. So, right. So Roger's talking about changing your name, which was, maybe not so uncommon at a particular time. And it's interesting. Then It's because it's funny. Then you have to think about that one of two ways. And I don't know what the right answer is. It's worth thinking about. Is it somebody takes on a different name, like it's a nickname, right? Oh, he's Isaac and that's his name, but he goes by Irving because that's easier to say or more like whatever. But really they're Isaac deep down and they're using this nickname Irving, and people go by nicknames all the time that don't change their actual names and who they are. That's one way to look at it. The complete opposite way is to say, to the extent that the name is supposed to reflect the essence of somebody, what if the parents got it wrong? What if they didn't get, and this is something you see all the time, for example, with kids who are trans or non-binary. And part of the process is they need to come up with some new name. And there's a rejection of the old name because that old name is connected with an old identity, which not only no longer exists, but maybe was never even the right identity. And so it's considered incredibly rude if somebody transitions and then takes on a new name to refer to them by their old name. It's in trans culture, that's referred to as your dead name because it's not supposed to. So either way, so there's this question, right? In this ideal world, your name is supposed to, reflect something about the deep essence of you. So, do you treat that very casually and say, I can take on a nickname and I can be known by something else? Or do you take that extremely seriously, so much so to say, I was given the wrong name and now I need actually to be able to have a new name that aligns with who I actually am? Mark. And then I'll call you on your next one.
A lot of people came to Europe, so Moish became my.
Right.
They wanted it in a little better. They put Irving in very fine British, Jewish name.
Sure.
Jewish name was a British name.
Yes. John Stewart had a crack about Kyrie Irving's anti-Semitic remarks, saying it especially hurts coming from somebody named Irving, right?
Jewish people early in the 20th century, boys named Irving because Irving had one time of the British.
Right. So Mark is saying, again, for those on Zoom, that was pretty common at one point to be able to change a name, and especially, if a name seemed overly Yiddishized or ethnic, whatever that might be, to give someone a more proper, right? My grandmother, who I knew as Grandma Minnie, right? Her name that she was given was Fega Minna. She went by Minna. When she went to school, her parents, Mom, you might, if I have the details wrong on this, you can speak up, but I think it was her parents were told Minna isn't a good name for somebody who's enrolled in American school. They need to be given a proper American name. She was enrolled as Minerva. Wow, they really, really got that one right in terms of figuring out what the
Minerva Florence.
Minerva Florence, right? Minna Fega became Minerva Florence because they really figured out how to find like anyway. So yeah, Phyllis, you were going to say. Sure. Phyllis said that right. If somebody was sick, it was not uncommon to give somebody another name. And the Mishnah actually talks about that. It says there are 4 ways to be able to affect somebody's outcome, to affect their fate. And one of them is shinui shem, the change of a name. So it's not uncommon to maybe change somebody's name to give them a name, add something, a name like Chaim for life, or Raphael, which is connected to the word for healing, or Alta, which means old. So right, to say, may you live to a long life. Absolutely. But again, that changing the name is one that's based in this idea of saying that the names are significant. It's not just, it's more convenient to say Irving than Yitzhak or Yitz, and that it's going to sound more whatever. It's saying, no, our names tell us something real. Phyllis. Faggy became Phyllis, and here you are all these years later, and you're still Phyllis, right, Jack?
So I think I know why we did the Mishnah era.
Yeah.
Recognize that those that case.
Jack asked the question, why there are some names that nobody recognizes on the Mishaberach list. Is it for privacy? The answer is in some cases, yes. In some cases, people do not want to have their names said out loud. And then sort of their compromise is they'll want their name said in Hebrew. I think I can safely say at this point that one of those people was Carol Mamber, who really did not actually want her name said out loud at first when she was sick. And so she went on the Mishaberach list under her Hebrew name. And then what happened was when she got sicker and sicker, so many people were calling out her name and were getting kind of indignant. Why are we as a synagogue not saying her name? That I actually switched and I would say both names. I would say her name in Hebrew and I would say her name in English, because at that point, there really wasn't anything in the way of privacy there. Some people prefer using the Hebrew name because it's more traditional. By the way, parenthetically, we're used to the idea that traditionally, when somebody came up to the Torah, first of all, that person would have been a man and would have been called up with his father's name. That's how you got your name, son of your father. That's not what some people do that. That's not what I encourage. I encourage using both parents' names. But it's interesting that when you go on the Mishaberach list, traditionally, it's with your mother's name, not with your father's name. So some people do that because it's more traditional. Some people do that because at some level, what's the claim that we're making here? Your real name, quote unquote, is your Hebrew name, is your Jewish name, right? So even that's the version that says, even if you go by Irving and you sign Irving on your checks, and that's what your mail arrives on, you're still little Yitzi, right, inside. So some people do it for privacy reasons, some people do it for other reasons.
So what about what is it?
Yeah.
They do in the TBR. Are they using just strictly a Yiddish name, a Hebrew name, or?
So Jack was asking about the ultra-Orthodox, and they will only have one name. They're not going to differentiate between a Hebrew and except for Satmars. Satmars are strange. Satmars, it's worth saying in passing, basically out of sort of their own traditions, give very, very, very American. You get these ultra-Orthodox guys named Scott, right? They pick a completely whatever American, but that's not the name that's sort of their quote unquote official name for purposes of the US government, but it's not the name that anybody calls them by. You have one name. You don't have a bifurcation between your Hebrew and your English name. By the way, with all of our kids, Tzvi, Eladir, they don't have a Hebrew name that corresponds. Those are their names. That's what they get called up to the Torah as. So you'd get called an ultra-Orthodox, would get called by that name, Ben or Bat, son of or daughter of their mother's name. And that's how you would do it. That's how you traditionally would do it. Shakespeare said what's in a name. All right. So I'm going to push on a little bit because it is getting a little bit late. I will say, by the way, speaking of names, that I do have what I did for everybody whose Hebrew name I got. And for those of you who were on Zoom, I'll leave these in the office. So whenever you're in the synagogue next time, maybe tomorrow for lunch and learn, you'll be able to come and pick them up. But I took everybody's Hebrew name. I printed it out. Phyllis's happens to be first. So this is you're on top. This Phyllis Schreier. It says Tzipora, which is your Hebrew name, which goes with the Fega, by the way, right? Because the bird. I printed it out in a typeface that approximates sort of what's called stam, the way that it's written in the way the letters are written in the Torah. By the way, it's called stam because it's an acronym for Sefer, meaning a Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzah. Right? Those are the three things that a sofer would customarily write. A sofer stam is somebody who writes Torahs, Mezuzahs, and Tefillin. As part of that, we've got a little crown, by the way, on the tzadi and Sipora, because that goes on there. Hebrew pronunciation, Sipora. Who is that? Wife of Moses, meaning bird. Gematria, 375. What's another thing in that gematria that's equivalent to? Well, 375 is also the gematria for Shlomo, for Solomon, the wise. So you have wisdom as a tzipora, and there's also a tradition that some people have. So I put these in as well of bringing a verse from the Torah, or not from the Torah, from Tanakh. Sorry, from anywhere in the Bible, whose first letter of the verse has the same first letter as your name, and the last letter of the verse has the same last letter as your name. Like that's a verse that's connected to you. So for example, Tzipora, Phyllis, says, Tzion b'mishpat tipadeh v'shaveha b'tzedakah. Zion will be redeemed with justice, or penitent ones with righteousness. So that, I'm seeing Phyllis, oh yeah, that's not so bad. And some people have the tradition of saying that verse at the end of their Amidah, right? It's sort of this separate special verse that's connected to them. Some of these names, Mark, Menachem, Me'orenai mismach lev, shmoa tova tidashen atzam. A cheerful look brings joy to the heart, and good news refreshes the body. That's not a bad one for a doctor either. And I was thinking about Karen Saxton, who is Penina, right? The wife of Elkanah in the book 1 Samuel, meaning pearl. And your verse, Pitchu li sharet tzedek avovam odaya, open for me the doorways of righteousness, that I may enter and praise God. So you can do with these whatever you will, but they are a little party favors to take with, and I'll give out to the people who were here last week at the end, and then I'll put the others in the office so you can come and pick up while they're there. I do want to say, since we're talking about names, a couple of quick words about the most important names that we have in Judaism, which are the names of God. And we talked about those in the past, right? So God has two main names, Yud, He, Vav, He, which we pronounce Adonai, and Elohim. And we talked a little bit about that. We talked, by the way, I'll mention this for those who weren't here last week, that one of the ways that the rabbis end up saying that those two names are actually one name, this is the Aleph, which is sort of the letter that is probably most associated with God. It's right. It's pure potential, but it's not expressible. It can't be contained within sound. In fact, it has no sound. And so it's the first letter of Elohim. It's the first letter of Echad. It's the first letter of Anochi, of I, right? Oneness. And I'm a little bit too close to the Zoom. Or I guess you can see it on the other camera. And we talked about the fact that, right, an Aleph is also comprised of a Vav and two Yuds, right? A Vav has the gematria value of 6, a Yud has 10, 2 Yuds are 20, plus Vav is 6, it's 26, which is in fact the numerical value of Yud He Vav He. So this is our proof that the name Elohim with the Aleph is in fact equivalent to the name Adonai Yud He Vav He. If that's the kind of proof that you're inclined to look for. Yud He Vav He, it's worth pointing out, is the name that is most associated with mercy. When we talked about the tagin, the crowns before, and I said sort of the right-hand side is the one that's higher and the left-hand side is lower. The right-hand side, the side of mercy, is the side that's connected with the name Adonai. Adonai isn't the way that name is pronounced. Adonai is just literally a Hebrew word that means my Lord. Adoni is sir in modern Hebrew. And because we don't know how to pronounce the name, right? Tradition says the only person who knew how to pronounce the name was the high priest, who would pronounce it once a year when he went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, right? Because this name is somehow so ineffable, right? We talked about the fact that it's made up entirely of letters that really have almost no sound. Yeah. Right. Most of God's name is breath. Yod He Vav He, or very minimal sounds, and it appears to be some kind of non-grammatical form, conjugation maybe of the verb to be, which suggests that really, in essence, God's name is really actually linked more with boundlessness, but in fact being. Art Green, who's the chancellor of Hebrew College in Boston, says God is both being and becoming, noun and verb, stasis and process, All of being is one in a single simultaneity in God, and yet God is at the same time process without end. By the way, if you understand that, please explain it to me. Right, and so that idea is contained within God's name, Yod He Vav He. But if you take each of the letters individually, and this sort of comes back to some of the things we talked about in week 1 or week 2. And forgive me, I'm going to get a little graphic and a little PG-13 here for a minute, but I think you can all handle it. We divide God's name into the Yud and the He first, then the Vav, and then the He. What's the Yud? We talked about that sort of smallest, primordial, right, indivisible sort of symbol. The Yud is like the sperm, and the He we talked about is like the womb. So it's almost like God impregnates God's self in order to be able to create, as God's role is as creator, to create the world. So God's He is impregnated from God's Yud. Yud He in and of itself forms a name of God all by itself. Yah is a name of God, as in Hallelujah, or as in Karen's verse, Pitchuli Sharet Tzedek Avova Moda Yah. Let me enter them and praise God. So Yah by itself is kind of like a name of God that's sort of so ineffable that's not even connected to this world, because ultimately God is connected to this world. How is God connected to this world? The Vav of Yud He Vav He is like this tube. We talked about that a little bit as well in terms of the Vav. That's the conjunctive and disjunctive that connects God to this world. By the way, in Kabbalistic terms, for people who are so inclined, the Vav is the letter 6, is the number 6, not the letter 6, the number 6, right? Representing the middle 6 Sfirot, right? Yud and He are they're going to be the top, 2 of the top 3 Sfirot, because Keter is just too ineffable to even be contained. Maybe it's in the Kotso Shel Aleph. Yud and He are the Sfirot 2 and 3. Vav is the middle 6. And then the final He, which is connected to Shekhinah and God's manifest presence. Again, so I'm dipping into Kabbalah here, but that's kind of when you're talking about the mystical Hebrew Aleph Bet, it's not surprising that some Kabbalah is going to come into it. And so He is that, the lower He is that aspect of God that's closest and most present to us, and maybe even according to some traditions is connected to the Jewish people, right? In order to become the first Jews, Abraham and Sarah, Avram and Sarai get Hayes put into their name to become Abraham and Sarah, right? So maybe the Jewish people collectively in our ideal state are part of the lowest, most sort of earthly aspect of God, which is actually an incredibly beautiful and empowering idea if we ignore the fact that it seems to suggest other people might not be part of it. But to be able to say that we help complete some critical aspect of God's being, of God's existence, by making sure that we can operate as fully in this world as we can, and then the Vav, right, connects it up to that upper world. So I just wanted to say that quickly by nature of something about God's name. We have a strict prohibition, of course, against erasing God's name, which comes back to the book of Deuteronomy. And we know that if there's a holy book that needs to be disposed of, we don't just toss it in the garbage or the recycling or the trash, whatever it is. It has to be buried respectfully, like a person. By the way, this is also the origin, and we don't want to, casually write down God's name. So if you're, you might be familiar with the fact that the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, for example, the 15th of the month of Shvat. And what's the 15th? Well, the Taf is 9, the Vav is 6, 9 plus 6 equals 15. So that's where we get the 2, Taf Vav. That seems like an awfully complicated way to get to the number 15. Wouldn't be simpler to take a 10 and a 5? Well, 10 and a 5 is a Yud and a He. Yud and a He is Yah, which is a name of God. Well, that's not okay. We can't just casually write that. So instead it gets redone as a 9 and a 6. Right? So maybe a little bit familiar with that. So just quickly, that was just a little bit about sort of God's names and how those get connected through the different letters. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that in terms of those of you, the 10 of you who gave me Hebrew names so that I could write this all out, The lowest gematria is Tova with 22. Highest gematria is Janet, Yehudit, with 435. And even though Janet Yehudit only has one more letter than Tova, she still gets to, 423 more letters of you. You know what? I'm gonna pause there because I can see we're starting. Oh, what do we got here in the Karen Albert says, I must leave now. That was wonderful. Thank you, Janet. Love the explanation about God's name and Abraham and Sarah. Wonderful. Again, ideally, this is all supposed to fit together. My hope coming out of this class, and we talked about this, a little bit the first week when people were seeing things about letters and saying, well, this suggests this to me and that suggests that. And I was like, I never thought of that, but that's amazing. That's incredible. If nothing else, this is hopefully a really rich and fruitful and productive way to begin thinking about Hebrew words and breaking them down to their core elements and breaking them down to their constituent letters as a way of creating new insights and meanings. Because again, at the end of the day, that's what the rabbis were interested in. They were interested in gaining new understanding. And they were saying, if the words of the Torah are precious, then let's see what understandings we can also gain from breaking them down into their letters, the core elements, or even potentially into the strokes that comprise the letters, right? We're breaking molecules down into atoms, and then we're breaking atoms down into protons, neutrons, and electrons for what are all the different, in order to understand something about the deep structure of reality. Do I think that reality is actually made out of letters? No. Do I think that we can come up with really rich and wonderful insights that can enrich our lives by asking ourselves some of the questions and thinking a little bit poetically about the world that way? Absolutely, I do. And so with that, I want to actually wind up with a thought that comes from Sefer Hatmunah, which means basically the book of the image, which is a 13th century mystical book. And we talked at the very beginning about the fact that when we're talking about the Aleph, when we're talking about the Hebrew letter, we're talking about 22 letters. And for the rabbis, those 22 letters were the constituent building blocks of all reality, right? All reality is made of words. God speaks the world into being, let there be light. But what the words are made up of course, are letters. So in studying letters, we're studying the building blocks. All of reality, every single word that we have, at least in Hebrew, is made up of these 22 letters, just like, combined and recombined endlessly to create everything we might need, just like 98 elements. 98 different unique atoms can be combined and recombined endlessly to create literally everything that we will encounter in the universe. And so in the context of that teaching, sort of this core idea of these 22 letters comprising all of reality, I find it inexpressibly moving. The teaching that Sefer Hatmunah adds, that says there's actually a 23rd letter. There's a 23rd letter that hasn't been revealed yet. And in fact, it's Mashiach, it's the Messiah who's going to bring that 23rd letter and reveal it to us. It's like this missing particle, because although we have this world and it is wondrous and it is fabulous and it is mind-blowingly amazing, and I am grateful for this world and its wonders each and every day, we know this world is still broken. We know this world is still flawed. There's suffering and there's pain and there's death. It's not the world the way that we would want to see it. And what Sefer Hatmunah says is that's because we've only got the 22 letters. But there's this 23rd letter. And when Mashiach comes, Mashiach is going to bring that 23rd letter, and it's going to fit in all of the different patches and all of the places that aren't quite 100, only 99% perfect, not 100% perfect, because they're missing that one letter. They don't have that critical tool. They don't have that critical building block of reality in order to be able to make that absolutely perfect world, but it's there. It's there. And I don't know, for me, it is inexpressibly lovely. The idea of saying there's that 23rd letter, and it's out there. And if we do our parts to help bring Mashiach, then we're bringing us closer to the world where that 23rd letter can come in and sort of fix all of the flaws and all of the damage that still exist in this world despite all of its wonder and all of its miraculousness. So I wanted to close with that thought. I really appreciate your guys going on this exploration with me. I know this was sort of strange and esoteric stuff. I know that when I said the world is made up of letters, some people might have rolled their eyes and said, all right, I'm going to stay on and be polite for the rest of this session. But for those of you who hung in there, I really want to thank you, because I find this stuff absolutely fascinating. And I find it a very rich way to be able to think about, to think about reality, and to be able to think about how we can understand more about how we're supposed to be in the world as Jews, and how we're supposed to be in the world as people, because if it doesn't help us with that, then what good is it? So I hope it's done some of that for you. I would love to continue this discussion at any point. The spring is going to be a little less esoteric and a little bit more concrete. But I want to thank all of you for coming along with me on this journey. And don't forget your parting gifts. So thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi, for stimulating class.
All right. Thank you all. So let's see. We've got over here, I've got Karen's. Doesn't help for right now.
Love going on this journey with all of you.
I'm not that talented.
Thanks, Susan. Good to see you.
And
You too,
Susan,
Karen. Stay well.
I like your
Janet,
haircut.
all
It
right,
looks
I'm
really
getting all-
cute.
Thank you. I had it done today.
I'm getting mine done tomorrow.
And Karen, you were so right about Sam. I mean, like,
Right?
he is, when I heard you say that, I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
How
Before he even came out, he was.
like either he grew into, I mean, I didn't know him when he was really young, but either he grew into it or
When-
like started
when
like
he was when he was 3. That's what it was like. So obvious.
that. Oh, see, I guess
That's
I knew him,
beautiful.
like a few years before his bar mitzvah, so I guess I knew him when he was about 10. So
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
he was already there. Yeah.
Yeah. Just like when he ordered the donuts on Yom Kippur to the front door at the temple, his 2 great grandfathers were cracking up at that. Everyone else was appalled, but they were cracking up.
I'm sorry, that's what I thought you told me.
Okay, take care, everybody. Come to lunch and learn tomorrow. That should be very interesting too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, thank
Bye,
you.
what's up,
Bye,
everybody?
everyone. Is Lunch and Learn Zoom? I don't have anything at noon tomorrow, so I can actually come.
It's on Zoom as well, yes.
Okay. I don't move real well, so I'll be Zooming.
All right, you take care, Karen. I mean, Janet, I'm sorry.
That's okay. My mother couldn't, keep it straight either. So
My mother used to go through the whole litany,
The whole-
her
right.
sisters and.
yeah, nieces and nephews, everybody. Yeah.
And I've done that too.
My
guilty.
grandmother, when my grandmother did it, I always thought like, what is this? And then like, as my mother got to that age, like she was doing that too. And I go like, there aren't that many of us, but yeah.
When the rabbi before was talking about information that's put in, I was thinking of Wikipedia. And people write different things, but not necessarily the accurate.
That number stuff was real, like, that was really, and the whole God thing.
It's fascinating. It really is.
But I
It's
love that.
beyond me. It's beyond me, but it's
Well,
fascinating.
yeah, I kept like thinking, okay, now my brain is like really working hard, but that's good.
Of course,
It's because otherwise it just kind of stagnates, but it was
your
really
brain will
stretching
never
it.
stagnate, Janet.
Well,
I know you too well.
I have to, but you have to keep like exercising it. But that God impregnating himself
Yeah, that's a wonderful.
and creating
concept.
like people like,
Parchments.
wow, like we really ended on like the highest possible note. Like that was, yeah, that was very.
Nice to see that a lot of people are in the temple also. I just driving at night, I have to decide when I do and when I don't. But
Yeah.
anyway, take care, everybody.
Take everybody.
Bye.
Nice to see everybody. See you soon.
Bye. You too.
Other have more letters but that's because I said at the very beginning of the very first week, other languages don't. Other languages are human, and other alphabets are human creations. They're human orthographic conventions that are designed to be able to symbolize units of speech, to be able to. But the Hebrew alphabet, right? That's something. Those are the building blocks of reality that existed before creation that God used to.
No place for vowels.
There are no, the vowels are not letters. The vowels are not letters.
English there. That's why it's.
Maybe.
That's it.
All right, what do you got? Ryan?
So, 6 to 1 to.
Yes.
How's
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Almost.
Is,
I saw
Get it behind it. Oh my goodness, yeah. I love that. Awesome. I'm so glad that you guys. You guys were here. I know that people probably were as well. Sure.
Yeah.
And you'll be here tomorrow. I will do my very best to make myself known.
I mean, opposition.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's. Right, and it's not really happy with this thing.
Yeah, right, that's right, because, and that's a reaction, right? Because if you don't take names seriously, you say, all right, that's a coincidence. I mean, it's unpleasant, it's unsavory, but it doesn't really implicate me in any way, because of course it doesn't. But nonetheless, if you take the powers of names seriously, you can say, right there. I don't want to just walk around carrying it. I'm still confused of the relation between Tova and the Devona and the unsavory person. Was the Tova connected to the unsavory or?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Guys, I'm sorry.
Failed advertising.
Devona, okay.
So
Well, if you-
That's your point.
Tova. Got it. You did write Tova Navona.
Yeah.
All right, I might have to go back and redo your horoscope, as it were. So,
Thank you.
yeah, all right. Why is this not going off?
Who's David?
It's David Edelson.